Thanks for tuning in. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guests and do not reflect the views of the Oswego Alumni Association, SUNY Oswego, or any of its officials. Email us with guest ideas at alumni@oswego.edu. Welcome to the Oswego Alumni Podcast. I'm your host, Dee Perkins. Today's guest has his eyes on the stars and the solar systems far beyond our planet. He's boldly going where no man's eyes normally go, and he is also one heck of a musician. I spent the morning listening to his music, and it's unbelievable that he has these two talents in science and in music. We are traveling into space with astrophysicist, teacher, and awesome guitarist, Earl Bellinger. He's the class of 2012. Thanks for taking time with us today, Earl.
Yeah, of course. Happy to. Thanks for having me on.
So you are currently in a time zone far, far away from us on the East Coast. Let's start with where you are and what you're doing there today.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm in Munich, Germany. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics.
And what got you interested in astrophysics?
Actually, it was my time at Oswego. So when I came to Oswego, I was studying computer science and mathematics, but I spent a lot of time in the physics department. And there I got linked up with Professor Shashi Kamber, who studies variable stars. And he got me interested in this study. I wanted to be able to contribute to science somehow. And so I wanted to work with him. And he put me on some projects analyzing variable star data. And that's still what I'm doing to this day. And I still work with Shashi, still collaborating.
So you walked into Shashi's office and basically fell in love with the subject matter.
Pretty much. Yeah, exactly.
That is amazing. You know, a lot of people try really hard to find the thing they're in love with in college, and you just kind of lucked out.
Yeah, it was super serendipitous. Actually, I thought that it was probably too lucky. So I went around and I smelled the roses for a while, and I worked in a bunch of different fields, trying all sorts of different things, not just variable star research. I actually did something like 7 internships in different places all around the world. But in the end, I decided, variable stars are what called to me. And that's what I decided to do my PhD on, and now several postdocs. And yeah, it's my thing.
So explain to us normal humans and maybe Star Trek fans what variable star research is about.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing, and this compelled me from the very first moment, is that stars are not constant in brightness, but actually they change over time. And some of them change very rapidly. We're talking in some cases hours or days, but in some cases minutes. They get brighter and they get dimmer again. And yeah, you normally think of stars as being constant, but they're in fact not. Even the sun is not constant. And this is a fact we didn't know until the 1960s. And that's because although the sun is variable, the amount by which it's changing is very small, really small changes. Like the solar surface is moving of order a meter due to these pulsations, but it takes about 5 minutes. So the sun is pulsating with periods of about 5 minutes. And I just find that fact astonishing. And it's useful for all kinds of things. So the first time we found a periodic variable star was in the 1600s. There was a star that took about a year to disappear and then reappear again. And then they tracked it over centuries, and they saw every year it would disappear and reappear very slowly, coming and going in. This star's name is Myra, for wonderful. It's Latin for wonderful. And I truly think it's wonderful. And it's beyond just the intrinsic interest that these stars are changing. It's telling us about facts about the star, about the internal structure of the star, about the evolutionary history of the star, the age of the star, what the star is made out of. All these kinds of things we can infer based off how the star is pulsating. So we get these wonderful insights about the stars themselves. And that speaks to an even deeper interest for me, which is that, okay, the stars have these properties. Why? Why do the stars have the ages that they have? Why are they made out of what they're made out of? We can start to ask these questions. And so this builds up a picture of how the universe developed over time. Well, why produce these kinds of objects? And it allows us to also test our understanding of physics in really extreme environments, because inside of a star, obviously it's very hot, it's very dense. these are not temperatures or densities that you can reach on Earth, right? And so if we have a theory about what happens in places with high temperatures and densities, stars are the only place that you can test that theory. And so, yeah, they give us a window into getting some deep insights about physics.
When you talk about testing, obviously you're not going to the star and performing experiments. I'm guessing the testing phase is using mathematical theories and plugging in values that you get from the stars.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it would be difficult to drop a thermometer into the sun, right?
Right.
And likewise, to figure out something like the age of the sun, you can't just use a stopwatch. It's just not going to work out. So you need another way of reasoning about these things. And so what we do is we use numerical simulations. So I'm a developer of this code called MESA, which is Modules for Experiments in Stellar Astrophysics. And this code is, it does physical simulations of the structure and evolution of stars over time. And then we can use that to assess how they pulsate. And so you can put in different information about a star. For example, you can put in stuff like, okay, I have a theory about what happens to matter once it hits a certain temperature, for instance. And then you can put that information into your simulation and see how that changes the observed properties of stars. And then you could say, okay, well, do we actually observe these properties of stars, or is this theory incorrect? And so this provides a mechanism for testing our understanding of physics.
Okay, so I'm just a communications graduate. I'm going to try and follow along here. Based on what you said earlier, that stars actually light up and then go dim, is it possible that matter itself actually doesn't ever disappear? It just maybe changes its shape, changes the way we see it or experience it?
That's an interesting and deep question. So
I feel so good right now. You have no idea.
Yeah. So I think fundamentally what you're getting at is what we call conservation of mass and conservation of energy. And these are like fundamental bedrock principles in physics. And this basically says like, you can never get rid of energy. You can only transform it. So if you have a closed system, the total amount of energy always stays constant. So when these stars are pulsating, it's not like they're gaining or losing energy. In fact, they do lose a bit of mass over time, but their mass is remarkably stable over many years. For example, the sun is 10 to the 33 kilograms, right? And it's crunching hydrogen atoms together in its core to produce energy, right? So what's happening in a star is you have the enormous gravity that's pulling the star together, trying to make it collapse in onto itself, trying to pull it down to a single point, really. I mean, you think about that enormous amount of gravity. Initially, it's successful, right? When a star starts to form, the gravity brings it together and nothing's really resisting it very much. But eventually, once the gravity pulls it together into a star form, then you get the onset of nuclear fusion. So the conditions are ripe where the density is high enough, the temperature is high enough that the protons in the core of something like the sun start smashing together. And when they do that, they actually release energy. This is Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. When you put together 4 protons, you get a helium atom. But that helium atom has a difference in mass with respect to those 4 protons. And so E is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light. And so the difference in mass, that's what gives you this enormous amount of energy, because that difference in mass is extremely tiny, right? The difference in mass between 4 protons and a helium atom is just a really tiny number. When you multiply that by the speed of light squared, you get this enormous energy, enough energy to resist the collapse of the sun. And that energy source is sufficient to allow the sun to shine in its current form for 10 billion years. And then that mass defect, the sun actually loses that mass. So the sun is losing mass over time, but it's losing something like 1 part in 10 to the 15 of its mass per year. So it's an extremely small amount, but we can see this. The sun has something called a wind. It's windy around the sun. The sun has the solar wind. There's these particles that are leaving the sun. Sometimes it's an eruptive event like a coronal mass ejection. The sun will just like give off a bunch of mass all at once, but usually it's more of a slow process. And so the sun is actually losing mass over time, not gaining any. So monotonically, it starts to go down. that mass then gets transported throughout the solar system, and maybe even leaves the solar system eventually into the interstellar medium. But that mass isn't truly destroyed; it's just converted, and that remains in the universe. And so we do think that in closed systems, mass is conserved, energy is conserved. These things stay constant.
So when you
But
said
it is a deep fundamental question. I mean, in principle, these are things that we should be able to test. You know, is mass truly conserved? Is energy truly conserved? Because these are our bedrock theories.
So when you said the first thing, which is that stars tend to go out and then come back, you just made me feel better, because the sun has 10 billion years of energy to continue going on. So I shouldn't have to worry right now about the sun going out.
Yeah, hopefully not. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so the sun will eventually go through its supply of energy in its core, and that's when the sun will turn into a red giant. So currently, the sun is middle-aged. It's fused about half of the hydrogen that's available to it in its core, and is 4.5 billion years old. In another 4.5 billion years or so, that fuel supply will run out. And because that fuel supply runs out, then gravity starts to win again, right? And it tries to crunch it down. But then a very interesting thing happens, right? The sun will have converted all of the hydrogen in its core into helium, right? So it then has a helium core, but surrounding the core is still hydrogen. That hydrogen surrounding the core turns into the new fuel source for the sun. So it has a new fuel source, which is a shell around this helium core. And that shell source is enough to make the sun survive for, let's say, another billion years, but that causes the entire star to expand dramatically. What happens is this helium core will compress in on itself, and the envelope will expand. And actually, this is one of the big uncertainties in our stellar evolution models. I was telling you about the wind around the sun, right? The wind is how the sun loses some of its mass. Once a star becomes really big and luminous, it loses a lot more mass. Once the sun's a red giant, it'll start shedding mass. And actually, you've seen astrophotography. There's lots of beautiful stars out there. The ones you most frequently see are the stars that have lost a ton of mass. Because if you've ever seen a star that has this beautiful blanket around it, you see like ripples around it, that's a star that's just throwing away its outer layers once it's become a big red giant. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because when the sun becomes a red giant, depending on how much mass it will lose, if it loses only a small amount of mass, it will actually expand enough to eat the Earth. It will certainly eat the inner planets. Mercury stands no chance, just absolutely no chance. We'll be devoured by the red giant sun. But Earth, we're not 100% sure of the fate of the Earth. It's certain that the oceans will boil. It's certain that life will become, the red giant sun's not hospitable to life on Earth, but it's not yet clear whether or not the sun expands enough to engulf the Earth in a few billion years. Of course, that's a long time away, so we have time to worry about it. But it is something we need to think about. And there have been some suggestions of how to save us from the red giant sun. For instance, one idea is to try to deliberately pull mass off of the sun. This is called a Lazarus star, where you pull enough mass off to kind of maintain the properties of the sun. This is, of course, sci-fi. I mean, we don't have the technology for this, but maybe in a billion years we could do this. The other opportunity is maybe we could redirect comets to try to push out Earth's orbit. And if we could do that, we can stay at a safe distance. We could maintain basically our current distance to the surface of the sun and try to keep the conditions for life. Again, these are problems not for today, but humans in billions of years will have to worry about them.
When you meet someone at a dinner party and they say, "Why should we care about astrophysics?" Is this something you bring up?
Yeah, they have big problems when they ask me about that, because they'll get me talking, and they won't have a peaceful dinner afterwards.
No, they're going to be worried that the sun's going to turn into a big giant red thing that eats us and boils the oceans. Pass the shrimp cocktail.
I mean, so that's of course like a fun thing to think about, but there's actually more. I mean, if I take this question seriously, right? There's examples in the solar system that have already profoundly helped us as a species. For instance, we had this big problem in the 90s with CFCs killing the ozone layer, right? And this was causing skin cancer, and it was a major problem. Well, how did we discover that? How did we know that this was happening? Well, obviously we have radar and other such things, but more fundamentally than that, even earlier, we looked at Venus. Venus has this thick atmosphere, and it has a runaway greenhouse effect. And by studying the runaway greenhouse effect on Venus, we got to see how these processes operate in a similar way on Earth. That allowed us to ban these things that were destroying the ozone layer, and told us that, for instance, the climate catastrophe is a big problem, and it's something we have to take care about. So studying the planets in our solar system, or planets in other solar systems, that they give us a lot of information, because the Earth is just one data point. Of course, it's the one we get to study up close, but knowing what happens out there, that we can use that information to reflect, and it's extremely valuable.
So when you were a student up at Oswego back in 2008, I imagine you're about to head over to Yale and teach yourself. I imagine that the ways of a teacher have changed a lot since 2008. How do you expect to reach students in this kind of new internet TikTok atmosphere that we're in?
Oh, that's a great question. That's one I've been giving a lot of thought to, of course, now that I'm going to start teaching my own courses, which is, of course, a very exciting and scary opportunity. Well, first thing I'd like to say is that the quality of instruction at Oswego is phenomenal. And I think one of the reasons for that is because so many of the instructors are focused on teaching people who will become teachers. And so I always felt like the quality of education I got there was outstanding, because you have a lot of people who care about pedagogy. That's super important. And so that's like a lesson that I try to take with me, which is that you can't just assume that you'll automatically be good at it. You should look into the research about what makes a good teacher, and what are the techniques for teaching a course. There's, of course, a lot of new literature on things you can do to be a more effective educator, things like active learning, which is something that I experienced as a student at Oswego, but I think that other universities are slower to pick up. Active learning is, of course, when you get the students engaged during the class time, instead of it having simply being a one-way transfer of information where you have a lecturer and people attending the lecture, you get the students doing things. So one basic thing is you get the students to get together in a group and they solve a problem together and they teach each other, that kind of thing. So that stuff is very important. Well, from my own point of view, what I'm going to be teaching is scientific computing, which is perfect for me because that's what all my training is in. I studied computer science at Oswego, and then all my research is in applying computational techniques to astronomical data. And so I'm a big fan of scientific computing, and I feel very happy that I get to teach it. And one aspect of this is that the course that I am inheriting, I'm very, very lucky to be inheriting this particular course, because the previous professors, they put together this wonderful open source, open textbook that's online, and it uses something called a Jupyter book. A Jupyter book is it's modern technology. It's a textbook that's online that has code, written in a programming language embedded inside of the document. So normally when you read a textbook, it's physical, and then you see a diagram and you have no idea how this diagram was created, right? It's just there. It could have been out of thin air. Of course, they probably discuss the diagram, but they don't show you actually how the cake is made, right? The beautiful thing about these Jupyter books is that every single bit of it is transparent. When you program a diagram, right? When you construct a plot or something, you load up some data, you visualize it. It shows you every step of the way how the person who prepared the text created this diagram. And so that's like a double whammy in my book. Not only do you get the very useful information of what the thing is trying to teach you, but it also shows you how the expert went about creating this visualization. And so if you're a student, those are the two things you need to know. You need to know the scientific insights, but also how you arrived at those scientific insights. I think that's a critical thing that's missing from education, especially from science classes, which is paradoxical, right? Because in science classes, you're supposed to learn how the way the world works, but we have such a long tradition of understanding how the world works, going back 4,000 years, that a lot of the stuff is like, yeah, I mean, people know this is true. People just know how water boils and things like that. You don't get a good scientific explanation. You just get, these are the facts, remember them. And that's why I love this new approach, which is, here is how you get to the facts, and then here are the facts, right? It's this way of scientific reasoning. It's this way of doing the process. And that's what makes me so excited for this next step, is that I get to teach in the way that I think is best for teaching, which is that you have to engage your critical thinking skills the whole time. Of course, there's all this stuff you have to learn and remember, but there's all this stuff about how do you reason to get there that's embedded in this approach of teaching. So I'm excited for that.
When I was a student, that was so important to me. I needed to know the process. And when I ran into a class where it's just memorize these facts, I had such a hard time, because why am I memorizing these facts? Whereas someone said, this is how you do it, do. And then it was in my brain forever.
Exactly. Completely agree.
Yeah. So I think that that's going to be wonderful when you get to Yale. So on the pop culture side of things, I thought this would be a fun question to ask. Do you watch any of the sci-fi shows, and are any of them kind of getting it right?
It's a good question. I'm not a good consumer of television, but there are a few that I like. Let's see. It's hard to list. I am a fan of Rick and Morty. It's the example in my head where I'm like, don't say that one, don't say that one. Okay, say that one. Yeah.
Star Trek versus Star Wars.
Yeah. So I would like to say that I enjoy them, but I don't really consume them. I've only seen a few episodes of Star Trek. I do like it. I appreciate the philosophical aspects about it, but there's just so much to it that I haven't watched it. I know it's like critical homework that I need to do, and everyone always points that out, but I haven't seen. It kind of makes me laugh. I was just watching an interview with Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who's made ChatGPT, and they asked him what he thought of the movie the movie Ex Machina, right, where the artificial intelligence wakes up and takes over the world or whatever. And he says, oh, I haven't watched it. And I'm sitting there thinking, you haven't watched it? Like, come on, this is your homework. You have to watch this. But I think it's less important for me to watch Star Trek than it is for Sam Altman to watch Ex Machina. So hopefully I can be excused.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Since you went around that corner, I'm just going to ask, any thoughts on ChatGPT and AI?
Yeah, sure. Too many. So first of all, I think it's a wonderful tool. I mean, it's no surprise. I love artificial intelligence. It's what I studied at Oswego. I did the concentration in artificial intelligence. So I was taking very wonderful classes with people like Craig Gracie and David Van Pola, who were teaching us not only symbolic AI, but also neural networks, which underpin ChatGPT. And I've been playing with chatbots ever since I was very young, and they've always been immensely disappointing until recently. So I was really encouraged to see first GPT-3 come out a few years ago, and then ChatGPT based on GPT-3 was very, very encouraging. Now it's taking the world by storm. Yeah, I have a lot of scattered thoughts on this topic. So first thing is that I think it's clearly the way of the future. And so resisting it is, to borrow from what I don't watch, resisting it is futile.
Resistance is futile. Yes.
Yeah.
I knew I'd get you there.
Yeah. That being said, we have to understand its capabilities and limitations, because it is both highly capable and highly limited. And I think that's clear to everybody who uses it, even for a few moments. So it displays extremely remarkable breadth of understanding on a huge array of topics. That's absolutely without question. But it also has serious limitations, and it's extremely confident in areas where it has no information, right? It makes up stuff, in other words. And so it forces us to be much more critical when we use it. I think if you use it uncritically, you're making a fundamental error. You always have to question what it says. And I think we as a species can kind of go two ways with that. If we use it responsibly and we take it upon ourselves to become more critical readers, it will absolutely heighten our abilities. But I mean, you saw on the news this week, probably, for instance, that some lawyer used it uncritically and is in all kinds of hot water. Just don't be that person, right? Don't just assume that what it tells you is true. That being said, if you do your due diligence, you look up what it tells you and you try to use it responsibly, it can absolutely accelerate your skills. And there's a few areas where it's extremely great. The area that I use it most for is text to code, right? You put in what you want and it gives you the source code for what you're trying to do. And if you're already fluent in a programming language, then the task of verifying that it has given you the appropriate thing is much easier than it otherwise would be. So that just massively accelerates any workflow. So it absolutely should be used. I don't know what the policy is at Oswego. I know that some universities are banning it. I think that this is similar to when people were scared about calculators and word processors. I think that these tools are not a replacement for our capabilities, but an enhancement to our capabilities. And they have their time and they have their place. And we need to learn how to wield them appropriately. Because in the real world, people can and will use AI. And it's only going to get more sophisticated. And so the time is now to start using them, to invest in our skills of getting fluent in them and to be prepared for the next generation of AI tools. I mean, the current level is pretty sophisticated, but it's going to get dramatically better in the future. I mean, that's absolutely clear. So there's no running from these things unless we decide to shut them off, which might ultimately be a sensible decision, but I don't think that that's what we'll do. So I think we need to be prepared for a GPT-based world, and yeah, we need to be ready for it. It raises a lot of deeper questions than what I'm addressing here, because everything I've said is basically short-term. How do you use it on an individual level? I think we're facing societal level crisis, not with the current level of model, a little bit. I mean, you're going to see unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of terrorism with GPT, right? Because it's very easy to make spam mail with GPT. If you link GPT up with speech synthesis or video synthesis, then you can make fake videos, fake images. You could conceivably call somebody with a video of their mother using possibly her voice, if she's on YouTube, for instance, asking for money. And this will fool people. And maybe not today, but certainly within a year, this stuff is going to happen. It's going to be all over the news. We're going to see it all the time. You're going to see major worldwide crises that are linked back to these AI models. And so we need to be prepared for them. And this preparation is the only immunization we have against these things. I mean, a lot of people saw this picture of the Pope, right? Wearing, it wasn't a real picture. He was wearing some robes or something. It wasn't real. But a lot of people immediately said, okay, this looks very convincing, but I don't believe it because I know AI is real now. And that's what happened. Like some people were fooled, but most people were not. And we need to be prepared for this level of deception to start coming, because it's going to come in all the time, nonstop, all the time from now on. So
it's funny to hear.
Maybe that's enough on that topic. But
No, real quick. It's funny to hear you say that you're positive about it in the beginning, because you've studied it and can be helpful. I understand. I do HTML code. So if you put into ChatGPT, how do I make a double space? It's a weird set of integers, and it would be great to have that information. But yet, if we scrape today's podcast and I say, what does Earl Bellinger say about the sun? And he puts back, the sun is going to boil the oceans. We're in trouble then, So in a world where you really come up with facts based on years and years of experience and study, the thing that must concern you the most is this thing that will put out false narratives.
Yeah. And so it's kind of a funny thing. So there's this effect called the Gelman amnesia effect. I don't know if you've heard of this, but I like this idea. And I think it's really true. And it's something that I experienced firsthand. It's where, okay, this is given from the perspective of Gelman, who won the Nobel Prize, right? The idea is like Gelman's like reading the newspaper and he reads some nice article on, the rainforest, and then he reads another nice article on, the world economy, and then he gets to an article on particle physics, which is his area of expertise. And he said he's reading this article. This article is garbage. Every single fact about it is trivialized and oversimplified. They confuse cause and effect. Everything is wrong. Like literally the whole article is completely wrong. It's garbage. It's of no value. And then he goes on to the next article, which is about, Spain or something. Oh, what a nice article. This is the amnesia effect, right? It's only the topics for which we have expertise, where we have the capability of understanding just how wrong these things are. So I use GPT and I ask it all kinds of questions about the world and whatever else. And I'm a bit skeptical, but and then I ask it questions about astrophysics, and it just gets them terribly wrong with the same level of confidence. And then I have to remind myself of the amnesia effect, because I see how wrong it gets it on the one area where I have the expertise to know that it's getting wrong. And everything else, I have to do the due diligence, because if I don't, I'm going to be led astray. For instance, if you ask it everything I told you about the sun, I've asked ChatGPT what it thinks, and it just gets everything wrong, right? Every single thing, like what's the future of the sun? How long could the sun survive without fusion? All this stuff, it just gets completely wrong. But then once you start prodding, you say, actually, this isn't right. It'll say like, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, as it typically does. Because everyone should know by now, a typical experience with GPT is you have to prod it and say, is that really the case? Oh, I thought X, Y, Z. And it'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, etc. Even if it got wrong, it'll say, I'm sorry. Even if it got it right, it'll say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and make some trivial correction. So we live with some uncertainty. There's an analogy I like here, actually, which is if you read Wikipedia, right? If you read Wikipedia, you're reading along, and it'll say with a hyperlink, like citation needed, right? And then you say, oh, whoever edited this is right. The person who wrote this originally, they wrote this statement on bad evidence. We need a citation here. Or they'll say like, confusing argument, or they'll annotate the text. And I've always found it to be an incredibly useful exercise to read and pay attention to the annotations on Wikipedia, because this makes you a critical reader, right? You read it and you say, oh, that's right. Someone pointed out that this isn't actually a strong point because they haven't supplied evidence. And this is the same energy we need to apply towards GPT, right? GPT needs to start citing its sources and things like that. But in lieu of that, we still have to be extremely critical readers, right? And we have to learn from things like annotated places like Wikipedia, how to be critical readers. So yeah, that's basically my...
Wikipedia did that on their own, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So could we force the GPT guys to do that?
That's certainly what a lot of people are working on. It's an extremely difficult problem, right? Otherwise, we'd have it already. But Bard, Google's response to ChatGPT, tries to have evidence in its answers. Bing is based on GPT-4. It tries to link up with evidence when it replies. So you see like superscript with like what links it's pulling its information from. Even ChatGPT itself now for subscribers has a model that tries to incorporate evidence. But these things are very difficult problems. It's really not clear how to actually make it more factually based. The funny thing is when you talk to a scientist, it's really different than talking to GPT, because a scientist, every other thing they say is, oh, I don't know, this is outside my expertise, this is really uncertain, I don't know that, but maybe I know a little bit about this, and here's where I can point you to look more. Whereas GPT says with full confidence, XYZ, but in fact, none of those things are right. So we need just a bit more humility in these models. But again, I think these are more or less short-term problems. I hope these problems are solved. I think we do, in general, face a crisis of low amounts of information. We all hoped going into the information age that we would get highly credible information, right? That was like the promise in the 90s. When everyone got on the internet, we'd all be way more informed. We have information at our fingertips, et cetera. But what we've seen is largely a bifurcation in people. Some people have really gone deep in their knowledge and really couched everything in something that's verifiable. But other people, they don't care. They don't care about level of evidence, and that's a major problem that's facing our society. GPT is not the worst offender, but it is an offender, and it's something. Yeah, I mean, you basically never benefit from having worse information. There's a few there's only a few moments that I can imagine where you benefit from ignorance. The only example that really comes to mind is this metaphorical truth of all guns are loaded, right? That idea is better than the truth. Yet it's not like you literally believe this, right? It's not an actual belief you have. It's just something that's better than, in terms of actions, better than the actual truth. But other than that case, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to conjure a situation where false or incomplete information is better than the true information. And so hopefully we can really realize the dream of the information age and get good, high quality, credible information reliably.
So on a lighter note, I'm gonna take you into an area that I have no idea if you have an opinion on this, but it's just kind of fun to ask. Do you believe in extraterrestrials?
That's a fascinating question. And it's one where a lot of very smart people have come up with a lot of very different answers. So there's this famous quote, there are two possibilities. The extraterrestrials are out there or they're not, and both are equally terrifying. I'm not sure if they're equally terrifying, but both are terrifying, right? It's a huge question, right? There's a lot of possibilities. So there's this famous equation called the Drake equation. It tries to estimate the number of intelligent civilizations that are in the galaxy. And how do you do this calculation, right? Well, you have to say like, okay, well, how many stars are in the galaxy? Okay, there's like 200 billion of them. How many planets are in the galaxy? Well, there's at least one per star. We know that now from the Kepler mission, by the way, which is pretty new information. That was actually like a great, it probably happened right around the time that I was graduating Oswego was when we found out that planets are common in the universe. It's like a profound fact. It's something we always assumed, you always assume that planets are all over, but it's a whole another game altogether to actually go out and find them, right? Say, hey, there's a planet, there's a planet. So stars are everywhere, planets are everywhere. And then you get into the questions of like, okay, how many of those planets are far enough away from their sun or their host star that they get enough light that you have liquid water, right? How many are in the Goldilocks zone? And then of those, how many would develop, let's say, single-celled organisms like bacteria? Of those, how many would get larger, let's say, fauna or mammals or something like that, or some alien equivalent? And of those, how many of them would become like an intelligent civilization? And at this point, you've begun speculating wildly, right? Like, how could you even begin to estimate how many of these planets will host simple life? You need to answer major questions in biology to get these estimates. And so people plug in different numbers into the Drake equation and they get different answers. Some people, some respected physicists believe that life should be common in the universe. You should find it all over. Maybe intelligent life is rare, but life itself should be all over. But other people will say, no, we are alone. We are like the lucky chance of the cosmos that we exist, and we are the only light of consciousness that exists in the galaxy, maybe even in the whole universe. And that even increases our pressure to be stewards of this special experience that we call consciousness, because if our light goes out, maybe it goes out forever in this universe. And so that's a weighty responsibility. And that also motivates, of course, these searches for extraterrestrial intelligence. Like, for example, the SETI project is looking for signs of life in the universe. And that would, of course, be probably the most major discovery ever possible, finding out that the aliens are real. Where I land personally, I think it's very difficult to say. I think that there's far too much uncertainty to say whether or not we are alone in the galaxy, much less the universe. It also depends on details about like Is the universe infinite? That's also a very interesting question. Is there a multiverse? Like maybe they're not in this universe, but in a different one. Some of these flirt on the border of philosophy and not necessarily science. So it's difficult to reason about them scientifically. Yeah, it's a very big question, whether or not aliens are out there. I think one thing is clear. There's no, so far, visible sign of aliens, right? I mean, okay, there's been some pretty hard to explain signals in the last year or two, but still no conclusive proof for aliens. And certainly nothing like, when we look out in the sky, it's not like we see Dyson spheres all over. A Dyson sphere being a mega structure around a star that's harnessing its energy. It's not like we see clearly that there's a super intelligent civilization elsewhere in the universe. And yeah, one thing to think about is we've only been a technological civilization capable of, let's say, radio transmission for a century, right? So capable of communicating with other intelligent life in the galaxy. That's only been within our reach for 100 years, whereas life on Earth is 3.5 billion years old, right? So if another civilization became intelligent, let's say for the sake of argument, we became intelligent 100 years ago. It's not strictly true, but technologically speaking, it's approximately true. If someone else had a 1 million year head start, right, which is not inconceivable given that our species is, life on Earth is 3 billion years old. If they got a 1 million year head start, I mean, you see the exponential rise of technology. These things would not be a little bit ahead of us. They would be astronomically ahead of us. If we had 1 million years more of technological development and we didn't destroy ourselves, you would expect that we would make significant exploration of the galaxy, right? We would certainly populate. We've already populated most of the planets in the solar system on a technological basis, right? We have a bunch of satellites around the sun. We have rovers on Mars. We have something that's flown by Pluto. We had 2 spacecraft that have left the solar system, right? That's within the last 100 years. That's within the last about 50 years that we've done this robotic exploration of the solar system. So if you give it 1 million years, right, we're certainly populating the galaxy. We're going to other stars. I mean, one exciting project that people are working on right now is this breakthrough starshot idea, which is sending a spacecraft to the nearest star system, which could be conceivably happening within our lifetimes, right? So within another 100 years, we might be flying by another star system. And so if you give this 1 million years, then we're populating the galaxy probably, or something of that scale. And so the question is, if there's other life in the galaxy, if it's intelligent, why haven't they done that? That's a huge question about why doesn't life exist? And some of the pessimistic, sorry, I know I go on and on about this, but some of the pessimistic interpretations of this is that, okay, maybe intelligent life doesn't survive the discovery of nuclear weapons. Maybe intelligent life doesn't survive the discovery of artificial intelligence. It could be that these things are such severe existential threats to intelligence that it simply wipes it out. And that's the reason why we don't see other things. It's not that they didn't develop, it's that they didn't survive it. And so that's a risk that we face for humanity. We're now flirting with the most powerful technologies you can imagine, things that could conceivably destroy our species. And so we have to take great precaution to make sure that they don't.
Wow. I'm going to make a hard left turn. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is in the pop culture world, probably the most famous astrophysicist is Brian May from Queen. And you and Brian May have something in common. You are both extraordinarily talented musicians. Is that
him more than me?
Is that a thing in astrophysicists that you guys get together and you have the best jam bands ever?
It is actually a thing. So Einstein was a violin player. Unfortunately, he didn't survive to be in my band. But at my old institute, the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research, I led a band of astronomers. We were called Mega Gauss, in honor of the mathematician Gauss, who started this observatory where we were studying. Carl Friedrich Gauss. And yeah, I still play regularly with a lot of astronomers. For some reason, there's a lot of crossover. For me, actually, the crossover makes a lot of sense because what I study in other stars are oscillations. And oscillations mainly, in the case of the sun, for instance, all the oscillations we see are acoustic oscillations. These are sound waves traveling in the sun. And so, yeah, I'm literally studying the sounds of the sun in order to gain insights about its internal structure and its evolution. And this has far-reaching implications for understanding the theory of music, for instance, on a fundamental and physical level. So I'll give you one example about this. If you play the note C on a piano, right, and you play the note C on a guitar, they sound different, right? Why do they sound different? This is a big question, right? You're playing the note C in both cases. Well, when you press C, you're not just getting the pure tone C. That would actually sound like a sine wave, you know, if you use like an oscilloscope or something like that in a physics class, you get this pure tone, like, you know, this pure tone that doesn't sound pleasing. But because a piano has a specific shape and a guitar has a specific shape, when you play a note, you don't just get that note, you get a whole series of notes on top of that called the overtone series. The same exact thing happens in the sun and in other stars. It has these frequencies at which it's pulsating, but it has an overtone series on top of that. And that overtone series tells you about the detailed structure inside of the sun. So just like you can listen to a guitar and you can hear that it sounds like a guitar, and that's based on the shape of the guitar and the physics of the guitar, you can look at the starlight from a star, you can see how it's pulsating, and based on that, you can get the detailed information about what it's like inside the star, physical conditions inside that gives it its particular sound. Actually, literally the sound of the star comes from its shape.
Is it also an emotional experience of playing music versus the scientific pieces of playing music?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, for me, the emotional aspects of music are what are so captivating about it. I mean, it's its own language. You know, you were kind enough to say that you were listening to my music. You see that I write instrumental music, and that's because I find music to be entirely its own language, completely expressive on its own, and you're able to express ideas that you simply can't say in common language. You know, it is its own way of expression, and it enables a certain vocabulary, some things that you wouldn't be able to say with words, but you can express them musically. Of course, music is an ambiguous language, unlike a programming language. It would be very difficult to give a set of instructions musically, but it's very difficult to give an emotional description with a programming language. So different languages have their different utility.
My last question is always the Oscar speech, and you've touched on it throughout the discussion we had today. But if you were getting an Oscar today, or whatever the astrophysicist thing is of a big award, who would you thank at Oswego for all the success that you're having today? What teachers, maybe students, your roommates, who would you want to give a shout out to?
Absolutely. Well, of course, there's a huge list of people, but the number one it always comes down to is Shashi Camber. And let me say why. So I mentioned in the beginning that I started working with Shashi, 15 years ago now. He was generous enough to give me a project and let me work with him, but he did so much more than that. So the first thing is that Shashi won these 2 grants from the National Science Foundation to start the SUNY Oswego Global Laboratory. And what this did was it took Oswego students and brought them around the world into different laboratories. For instance, I went to Brazil 2 times, and we got to do research on the cutting edges. This is just a phenomenal experience for a student. And for me, instantly, the first time I got there, like right there, as soon as I got there, it gave me such clarity. It showed me that I wanted to live a scientific life, a life not only, you know, of being a scientist, but doing scientific research and everything that comes with it. And so, and then Shashi opened all kinds of doors for me. He brought me to international scientific meetings. You know, he brought me to, for instance, the International Stellar Pulsations Conference in Spain when I was a student. He also brought me to regional conferences in the United States. He encouraged me to make posters to show off the research that I was doing and present them. And every bit of the way, even though, I mean, it's so funny for me because I can look back at my work as a student and, I was a student. It's not like I was doing anything groundbreaking, but Shashi was endlessly encouraging, no matter how easy this would have been for him, he made it sound so great that I was doing it, and that's so inspirational for a student. It's something he could have done trivially. He gave me a year or 2 years to sit down and learn all the skills I needed to do to figure it out and then to present it. And that's just an incredible opportunity that I wouldn't have otherwise had. And there's absolutely no chance that I would be here right now without Shashi's help. I wouldn't have studied stars. I wouldn't have done anywhere near this level of research. I wouldn't be becoming a professor at Yale. I mean, it's all insane, this journey that I've been going on. And it's all thanks to Shashi really believing in giving students this kind of opportunity. And so what I always tell the Oswego students is to keep your eyes open for these opportunities because they're all over Oswego. There's I think it's particularly in astronomy and in the hard sciences, but it's certainly all over. I mean, my experience is biased by astronomy because that's what I went through. But the reality of the situation nowadays is that there's a lot of people in academia and they have enormous talents. And so when Oswego hires a professor, it's a top expert in the world. There's no two ways about it. It's not like because it doesn't have as much resources, for instance, as a private graduate funded program, that you don't get as high quality professors. In fact, you get extremely high quality professors at almost every university in the world nowadays because the pool of people in academia is so incredibly strong, which means that at Oswego, where there are a few graduate programs, the undergraduates have enormous opportunities for research. Just go to the faculty members who are working on the things that you are interested in and talk to them and ask them what opportunities are there. There are so many opportunities at Oswego. You get to work with almost on any topic you want. There's an expert around who's basically a world leader in their field, up with all the latest research, doing all the greatest and latest things. And you have the opportunity as an undergraduate to work with these people, and it opens all kinds of doors for you. And if you want a career in science, you have to start early. You have to start as an undergraduate. You have to start getting this experience. And if you go to a private university, it's much harder to get started as an undergraduate because the faculty are busy with their graduate students. At Oswego, where there's fewer graduate students, the undergrads have enormous opportunities. So you have to seek these out. These opportunities are all over the place. So that's my advice. And that's my thanks to Shashi. I always give thanks to Shashi. Of course, there's lots of people in computer science and math who also helped me out. They would certainly make my Oscar speech, but the person to whom I owe the most is definitely Shashi Kamber. And by the way, I was very happy to see that he was promoted to distinguished professor, recognized throughout SUNY, I think, this last year. So he's getting all the recognition he deserves for all this phenomenal service he's done for students in research.
Oh, that's so amazing to hear. You're so passionate about him. And I want you to know I talk to alumni all across the fields, and everyone has a story like you. So I love that you said it's all available all across Oswego, because if you talk to someone from the communications department, the education department, they're all saying the same, business department, they're all saying the same thing.
Absolutely.
So luckily for us, it's a campus-wide phenomenon. And but you obviously know how things are playing out in the science area. So I loved what you said there. That's wonderful. Well, this has been a great conversation. I was frankly really worried. I emailed you and said I was really worried because I didn't think I'd be up to talking to an astrophysicist, but I actually picked you out because I thought it was such an interesting topic. And I want to learn things about things I don't know that much about. So you've just been a phenomenal guest and
well,
really lovely to talk to.
This is a great experience. Thanks for having me on.
So you can find Earl Bellinger on SoundCloud. I highly recommend listening to his tracks. And he has a website where he talks about all things astrophysicist at earlbellinger.com. And if you want to reach out to us with guest ideas, you can find us on Facebook or LinkedIn, or you can email us at alumni@oswego.edu. We're always looking for your stories. We have over 90,000 alumni that we would love to talk to. I'm Dee Perkins, and we'll see you next time on the Oswego Alumni Podcast.